Logarithms are musically interesting because of what they do to ratios. To put it simply, taking logarithms transforms equal ratios into equal differences. So if I've got a set of strings whose properties include a set of equal ratios, then I take the logarithms of the lengths of those strings, which is what Newton is doing in these calculations on this page. Then what will come out from those equal ratios are equal distances, equal differences between the logarithms, if you like. That's useful in music because it gives you a way to measure musical intervals, if you like. It gives you a scale in which equal intervals are actually represented by equal numerical quantities. Newton is one of the very first to use this logarithmic technique explicitly, to take the logarithms of the lengths of musical strings, discuss them and analyse them, even though logarithms as a mathematical tool have been around for 50 years by this point. He wasn't the first to apply logarithms to ratios. In fact, Kepler, the astronomer, had done very interesting work along those lines in the 1620s. It's not clear precisely which models, which predecessors Newton may have been aware of. Newton might also have found hints pointing towards this technique of using logarithms in Descartes' book on music. Descartes didn't use the technique explicitly, but what he did do was draw very interesting diagrams in which equal musical intervals have equal sizes. He actually sets them out in a circle. So if we've got a musical string, if we imagine a string from a guitar, as I go up the string, finger, 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 up the string, intervals get smaller and smaller as I go higher and higher. Equal musical intervals, tones for instance, or semitones, get smaller and smaller. You can see that when you look at a guitar, when you look at the pattern of frets on a guitar. That pattern reflects the fact that music deals with equal ratios. If we've taken logarithms, those equal ratios become equal distances, and we can set musical intervals out in a possibly more helpful way. And that's what Descartes had done in these diagrams, which Newton diligently copied out by hand. What we see on this page is a circle which represents one octave of a musical scale. This is on so to speak, a logarithmic scale in which equal intervals have equal sizes, or they would if this wasn't drawn by hand and rather messy. And Newton then sets out 5 different, slightly different musical scales starting on different notes of the scale around the circle in 5 concentric rings. He labels each ut, scales ut, re, mi, sol, fa, and so forth. He also, around the edge of the circle, gives some numbers which show how those notes might be represented by dividing the octave into 53 equal parts. Newton was very interested in the possibility of dividing the octave into some number of equal parts and thereby arriving at a useful approximation, a useful way of approximating a good musical scale. He seems to have favoured dividing the octave into 53 parts. That happens to give quite a good approximation to the set of notes of the scale that Newton thought was most satisfactory. But in these notes we can see him trying a whole range of other possibilities, dividing the octave into 20, 24, 100, I think 360 at one point. So Newton is very, very ready to undertake quite laborious calculations in order to try to get good approximations to the musical scale. One of the things that Newton is interested in is how to tune the musical scale, how to describe a musical scale that will be as satisfying as possible. At one stage he sets down what he calls a catalogue of 12 musical modes in their order of gratefulness. So he's not uninterested in practical questions of which forms of the musical scale are actually usable, which of them sound nice, and for all this mathematical complexity he does also have an eye on questions related to composition, if you like, which tunings are going to be most useful in which keys, and so forth. Perhaps predictably, Newton's strategy for getting at this question of which scales, which modes are most useful, most satisfying, is quite heavily mathematical. Having established his preferred tuning for the 12 semitones of the chromatic scale, Newton then asks himself, what happens if we want to play, say, a scale in white notes starting on C, or a scale with one sharp starting on D, or something? Questions like this. What are the particular scales that will come out of this set of 12 semitones? And he tabulates a very large number of different cases and asks himself which intervals in these scales sound good, given my tuning of the 12 semitones, which of them are tolerable, which of them don't really work. So for each of his quite long list of possible scales, he's then got some indication of how good it will sound. He uses that information to construct a table of the most satisfactory musical scales, given his particular preference for how all of the semitones should be tuned. At the end of all of these calculations, Newton does come to definite preferences about which scales he likes and doesn't like. He expresses a fondness for white note scales starting on E or on A or on D, for instance, but his particular mathematical interest seems to be in scales that are not just harmonious in the sense of containing a lot of intervals that will sound well, but that are also mathematically satisfying in that they read the same forwards as backwards. So if we have a white note scale starting on D, we have that property that the patterns of tones and semitones is the same forwards as backwards. And with Newton's characteristic placement of the semitones, it's actually exactly the same, both white notes and black notes, forwards and backwards, if we start on D. So Newton is working through his musical ideas almost entirely mathematically, at least on the evidence we have. He describes musical scales using algebraic letters and so forth. He certainly isn't, as far as we can tell, sitting there with a harpsichord trying things out and seeing what sounds good and what doesn't. So it's not clear how far this material is evidence about Newton's aesthetic sense. Most of the aesthetic results he comes to here seem to have been arrived at by solely mathematical means.